Hello everyone and welcome to today's talk. Today's question is, how can the Caribbean achieve food security? I think, especially in today's day and age with all the, black swans and crisis going on in the world, I think it's more than ever important for every country, and in that case, the Caribbean as a region, to make sure that you can actually feed your population, and therefore we want to have a look at today's status quo of the Caribbean food supply chain and their food supply in general. And we'll have a look at the requirements and therefore also have a look or discuss some of the potential solutions or recommendations that of the things that can be done to make sure that the Caribbean isn't reliant on external food supply or food imports. So let me pull up my slides here. So when we talk about Caribbean food security, that's how I want to structure this talk. First of all, we want to talk about the goal, then the requirements, and then the recommendations. Give me 1 second. So before we start, or if you're watching this live or as a recording, doesn't really matter. Let me know if you can see and hear me loud and clear. Leave a like there if the quality is great and you actually like that type of content. And as always, you can use the chat or the comment section to ask your questions, share your thoughts, agree or disagree, and just have a conversation. All right, so the goal should be national food security, meaning, or how can national food security be achieved? I think before we can answer this question, we need to define or explain what we actually mean by that. So the question then becomes, what is national food security compared to just food security in general? Because when we look at the general definition of the United Nations Committee on World Food Security, meaning when we talk about food security in general for the whole planet, then food security is defined as meaning that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy lifestyle. Ergo, a country needs to be able to produce the minimum required calories for its population without the need of foreign food imports. So that's the definition or the goal that we want to run with today, because we can talk a lot about different diets and different needs and requirement for a healthy diet. But at the end of the day, 95% of the question is, can we actually have enough, or is a country able enough to produce enough calories for its population so that they don't starve to death, and then vitamins and healthy food and everything comes after that, meaning is relatively easy to achieve compared to the calorie question. So then, how many calories does a person need per day? And depending on the sources, depending where you live, how old you are, if you're male or female, of course you need a different amount, but roughly on average, a human needs around 2,100 calories per day. And as you can see here, the top 10 or the bottom 10% of income can afford 1,500 calories, and the top 10% of income, globally speaking, or from the assessed countries here, can afford over 4,000 calories per day. That's why we, in especially developed nations or rich countries, see so much obesity, and too much calorie intake becomes a problem. So I want to break it down to really have a very tangible example on a Caribbean state that is hopefully representative for a lot of Caribbean nations, and maybe the most famous one, in that case, Jamaica, with the biggest population, English speaking, and so on. So we have roughly 3 million people there, not exactly, but with tourists, something around that. And as we just said, everybody needs 2,100 calories per day. We have 365 days per year. That means to feed the whole Jamaican population for 1 year, we need roughly 2.3 trillion calories per year. So that's a 2 with 12 zeros behind that. And when we then have a look at what kind of crops make the most sense, or what kind of crops have the most calories, then we have basically three. We have corn, potatoes, and sugarcane. These are probably the most calorie dense known to mankind, with around about 15 million calories that can be produced per acre. Requirements. So what do we actually need to be able to grow that food, or enough food to feed a population, in that case, and that's an example, Jamaica. So of course we need a suitable landmass, meaning we need enough land that can be used for agriculture to grow these kind of crops. We need a suitable climate, meaning enough sun, not too much, enough irrigation, rainfall, not too much. And last but not least, we need fertilizer, nutrients for the plants so that they can actually grow. So question number one, or point number one, suitable landmass. When we have a look at, again, the globe, the world first, then we see that Earth's surface is around 149 million square kilometers in land mass. The rest is ocean. Again, around 30% land, 70% ocean. Out of that 149 million kilometers, we have around 70%, meaning around 100 million square kilometers on habitable land, meaning not in Antarctica, not on a glacier or something like that. And out of that, we have around 50% suitable for agriculture, meaning 50 million square kilometer. And then most of that, more than 70%, almost 80%, is used for meat and dairy, and only 23% is used for crops, vegetables, fruits, and so on. But, and that's the interesting part here, although we only use 23% for crops, they supply over 80% of the global calorie supply. So basically the perfect Pareto principle here, around 20% of crops of the land mass supplies or provides 80% of the calories. And then we can split that into protein and protein from animals and from plant-based food. That's not what I'm going to talk about here, but we can see that we have roughly 1/3 of the landmass can be used for agriculture, and out of that, around 20% is used for crops, globally speaking. And when we then look at Jamaica, Jamaica has almost 11,000 square kilometers in area. And then we have around 202 acres, 202 hectares in active farmland. That number is from 2007. That's the most recent one that I could find. If you have more recent data, please let me know. So we have 200,000 hectares roughly in active farmland in Jamaica right now. And if we convert that into acres, that's around 500,000 acres. So 200,000 hectares, around 500,000 acres. And as we then remember, we have around about 15 million calories per acre if we grow one of these three crops: corn, potatoes, or sugarcane, which all grow in Jamaica. And then therefore, at least in theory, we could harvest 7.5 trillion calories per year. Maybe even more because, again, Jamaica has very favorable climate. We'll talk about that in a second, meaning there might be multiple harvesting cycles possible here. So if we then compare that to the needed amount, meaning 2.3 trillion calories are needed to feed the whole Jamaican population, and we have a potential supply of at least 7.5 trillion calories, again, probably, or not probably, but maybe more than we see, okay, there would be, at least from a landmass perspective, enough farmland, enough landmass that is suitable for growing crops to feed the population just from a calorie perspective. So next important part, besides land to grow or to practice agriculture or to grow crops, we also need a suitable climate to do so. Mainly sun hours, temperature, and of course irrigation. So when we look at the average daytime and nighttime temperatures here in Jamaica, then we see that we almost always have a temperature between 23 and 33 degrees Celsius, which is for most crops absolutely fine. We don't want to go over 30 degrees, so maybe in the summer that might be a little problematic, but all in all, we have very favorable temperatures here. And depending on the source that you look at, we have an average annual rainfall of 2,100 milliliter rain per year, which is again also suitable or enough rain to grow most crops. It's probably more a problem between the different climate zones on the island, where you have one very rainy area or rainy part, very wet part, and another area that is very, very dry and more desert-like. So the average annual rainfall might not be the best number here, but just to give you an idea. And then last but not least, maybe even the most important part of the whole equation is fertilizer. And you might heard a lot about fertilizer prices or natural gas and the war in Ukraine and things of that nature. So we will see how or why that is so important and why fertilizers play such a crucial role when we talk about global food supply, but also when we talk more specifically about Caribbean, or in that case, Jamaican food supply. So when we look at the world population over the last 150 years, roughly since 1850, then we see that at around somewhere between 1900 and 1950, the world population really starts to grow and really exploded. And you can also see here that was around the time where total nitrogen produced really start to exploding. Why is that so important? Generally speaking, a plant needs, besides again sunlight, air, water, it also needs nitrogen. It needs a few other fertilizer stuff and minerals and so on, but the primary, one of the most important ones, is nitrogen. So now you could think, well, there's enough nitrogen in the air. After all, like 78% of air is or contains or is made out of nitrogen, but that's in a form that is not really available for the plant. So therefore, in the past, what did people do? Basically, you took the nitrogen that was in organic matter, made a compost out of it, or put manure on the fields, and then microorganisms, bacteria, and so on broke that down in a form that the plant can actually absorb and use for plant growth. Therefore, food production was always very limited, and it was always very important how good your soil was and how much minerals and how much nitrogen your soil has on a natural basis, because on that soil you basically weren't able to grow anything. And then, as we saw, humanity figured out how to basically extract nitrogen from the air, put it in a salt, and make it solvable in water and therefore available or easier available for plants. And that's why we see here that today's population couldn't be sustained or couldn't be fed without synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which basically exclusively comes from a process that is called the Haber-Bosch process. Two Germans, Fritz Haber discovers the process in his lab, and then Carl Bosch basically developed the process that can be used on an industrial scale with BASF. And from that point on, we were basically able to use natural gas as an energy source to pull out the nitrogen out of the air and then put it in ammonia and urea, and therefore in salt form, in solvable and water solvable form, and therefore we could use it as a fertilizer, put it on the fields, and increase on the one hand food production, and then on the other hand, of course, the world's population today. Without that, we wouldn't be able to feed as much people as we have today on the planet. So, and then that's what you maybe know, or that's the form that you probably know: fertilizer or nitrogen fertilizer, and these kind of big sacks of little pellets that are then either put in the ground or again dissolved in water and put on the fields that way. But of course, there are not only upsides, besides the fact that, again, almost half of the human population is fed through that way. Without nitrogen fertilizer, wouldn't be able to sustain that big of a global population. But of course, we also have some downsizes of synthetic fertilizers. Mainly, if you do it too much, you can just burn your plants, meaning if there's a farmer who wants to get as much yield as possible and puts more and more fertilizer on the field, then that can also kill your plants and therefore ruin the harvest. Then again, because it is solvable in water, it can more easily leak into the environment. So for example, when you have floods or a lot of rain, then the salts and the minerals really get washed out of the ground and can leak into the environment and maybe even contaminate groundwater. Therefore, then other animals or humans drink that kind of water, and just generally speaking, can pollute the environment, harm people, can harm plants, can harm other animals. On top of that, again, over the last months, maybe 12 months, maybe a little longer, 24 months, we saw a pretty heavy increase in fertilizer prices. Again, there are basically three main fertilizer: nitrogen or NPK, nitrogen, potassium, and kalium or something. Third mineral, again, nitrogen is the most important one, but all of them, as you can see, increased in price over the last 24 months or so, meaning especially when you are a smaller farmer or not the rich country that can afford the higher fertilizer prices, to pay the higher prices to import fertilizer, then fertilizer becomes really a scarce good, and therefore can threaten your domestic food supply when you're no longer able to grow enough food to feed your population. So I think that's maybe the biggest bottleneck in all of that for the Caribbean, meaning we have usually enough landmass, suitable landmass to grow. We have a favorable climate, but are usually very dependent from fertilizer imports. Therefore, fertilizer prices have a big impact on the price of the final product. So then, of course, the question becomes, is organic farming better? Meaning, don't rely so heavily on synthetic fertilizer, but use more organic or natural methods, meaning more composting, more recycling of plant waste, manure, use manure as fertilizer, and so on. Again, as I said earlier, basically use the minerals, use the nitrogen that is there in organic form, break it down, let it rot, and let microorganisms make it or break it down so that it's available for plants. And the question is that actually better? And I think that's a very important question and something that we have to look very closely at, because especially when we're talking about organic or regenerative farming or green or all of these kind of buzzwords, we have to be we have to make sure that we're not only talking about a marketing thing and some greenwashing to make it look better or to make us feel better, and I don't know, go back to nature or be more natural, things of that saying, but really that it's actually beneficial for everybody involved and actually can keep its promises. So therefore, when we look at some studies and some data, meaning the environmental impacts of organic versus conventional agriculture, as we can see here, then we have to admit that the data is kind of indifferent, because on the one hand, when we look at greenhouse gas emissions, then organic methods look better, meaning they emit less greenhouse gas. When we look at the land use, then we see that organic methods perform worse, meaning you need more land mass to achieve the same output, to produce the same amount of crops that you would do with compared to conventional farming. And when we look at the potential of polluting the water or the environment in general, organic methods can even be worse compared to conventional farming. Or when we look at acidification, meaning making the water and the environment more acidic from the pH factor in the water, then also organic methods are not necessarily better, sometimes even worse. And when we look at the energy use, depending on what specific crop you're growing, it can be more energy intensive or can be less energy intensive. So we have to really look closely what we're actually growing here. But I think it's inaccurate, or basically when we look at the data, we can't say that organic or conventional is better or worse. I think both have their pros and cons. Like everything in life, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And therefore, I think we have to look very closely what actually could be solutions or ways to approach agriculture's food security from a perspective, if we focus more on organic or more on the conventional approach. And then, of course, the question is, do we maybe need bigger farms? Because the average farm size, at least in Jamaica, is around 1 hectare. Again, that's like 2.5 acres, like 2 to 3 acres. That's usually the average farm size for most farms in Jamaica, meaning usually very small scale enterprises. So what would be my recommendation? What would be some of the, again, trade-offs, not solutions, that we should have a look at when we actually say, okay, we have countries with, again, small land mass. How can we, with great climate, how can we make sure to be sustainable? For example, when we look at countries like the Netherlands, one of the biggest exporter of foods, or when we look at small countries like Israel with a lot of desert, but they're also very good in supplying or in creating their own food supply. I think these should be the examples maybe that we should look at when we want to think about, okay, what can we do to achieve the same amount of food supply, food security in the Caribbean. So I think it will be probably, or should be probably, a combination of, on the one hand, conventional, and on the other hand, organic or regenerative farming. Meaning, I think there are probably situations where conventional farming has an advantage, and there are also situations where regenerative farming has an advantage. Of course, I would always make sure that there are no environmental damages, no matter what kind of approach you are using, that you're really sustainable in the sense that the operation can continue long term over decades, and then not for the short gain you harm the environment in a way that makes it impossible for future generations to supply themselves. Which I think means to minimize and optimize inputs, meaning to make sure that you use as few inputs as possible, meaning as few land, as little as possible when you use fertilizer and so on, that you're really resourceful with your material and your equipment and the resources that you have, and really make sure to optimize the inputs compared to the outputs, because it does not necessarily mean that you always go for maximum yield or maximum output, but that you find the right balance between the inputs and therefore the damage that you do in some way or form, or the costs that you have on the one hand, and the output on the other hand. And I think a big contributor to that, or a good approach or starting point, should be, and I think that gets cheaper and cheaper and easier accessible by the day, is data collection and smart farms, meaning you can really put sensors in the ground to measure the moisture of the soil, the fertilizer amount that is still in the soil, temperature, sunlight, and so on, and can really use that to, as I said earlier, optimize your inputs, only water when needed, only fertilize when needed, and really use that to feed a database, make decisions based on hard data, have predictable AI maybe to really make sure, okay, when do I best buy my fertilizer, how much fertilizer will I probably need next year based on the data compared to other data sets and so on. And you really use the available technology that comes down in price by the day and gets cheaper and cheaper, to really even use that for smaller scale operations to optimize the yield without that much upfront investment costs for such systems. So data collection, smart farms, I think that's a good starting point and a good idea to look at for every government in the Caribbean when they want to support their farmers, when they want to support their agriculture and their food production sector. Then make sure that you secure your fertilizer supply or your fertilizer production. Again, BASF is by far the biggest chemical and therefore fertilizer producer in the world. You will never reach that amount of production capability, but make sure either through strategic and trade decisions that you always have a secure fertilizer supply chain, and maybe even able, and if it's only on a small scale, to produce your own fertilizer to be able to grow your own food and don't have that as a bottleneck. Of course, all of that costs money, especially when we look at the very small farms that are common in most Caribbean countries. I think it's very important to make sure that the farmers there actually have access to financing, to get that information, get that knowledge, make the necessary investments in that kind of smart technology, and therefore really optimize the food sector. Because a lot of farmers in the Caribbean are an unbanked population, therefore they often don't even have a bank account, therefore don't have access to financing to finance an upfront investment like developing farmland. So I think that's point D as a very important point or problem that needs to be addressed. So let's recap really quick. So if you stayed with me till here, feel free to leave a like, hit the like button, thumbs up button, wherever you are watching this. Generally speaking, the YouTube channel is, at least in my experience, the best and most stable connection and experience. So feel free to head over there and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And as always, feel free to disagree with me, ask your questions in the comment section, and let me know what you think. So recap, I think land and climate are suitable to feed the population in the Caribbean, although we always have very small island nations, and therefore very small land area and even smaller farmland area, it is usually enough, again, if you grow the right crops, to generate enough calories to feed your population. And again, the climate is so great that you can grow almost everything. So all the other nutrients that you need besides from calories, you could also get just from the crops that you grow there. So from that perspective, you're completely independent from other countries. You have everything that you need at home, basically. A problem is more the fertilizer aspect, meaning fertilizer prices are increasing right now, and therefore the supply for most Caribbean nations is unsecured, meaning at a certain price point it's just no longer reasonable to import fertilizer or to have farm production going at all. So therefore, fertilizer might be one of the biggest bottlenecks here. Step number 3, if financing is available, then it makes sense to use smart farming, big data, and AI to minimize the needed inputs and to optimize results, so that you really use the few resources that you have to the best that you can. So that's it from my point of view. Thanks for watching and for staying with me. And let me know what you think. If I missed anything, if you would add anything on top, or if you have any question, of course, feel always free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And again, if you like that, hit the like button, and so on. And again, I think food security is super important, especially for the Caribbean, which is very dependent on the imports that they get from the US. Again, nothing wrong with that, but just from a strategic perspective, if for whatever reason the US say tomorrow we limit the food exports or the food imports to the Caribbean, then a lot of Caribbean nations will have a problem. To prevent that, make sure you develop your agriculture sector, your own food supply, make sure there are enough calories produced on your domestic land, and use technology, use smart farming to get the most out of the resources that you actually have. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.